Good evening. This is the sixth night in. There we go. Thank you. This is the sixth night of the Institute, and this evening we have Emily Toth. She is an assistant professor of English at Pennsylvania State University. She's a graduate of Swarthmore College and received her MA and PhD from Johns Hopkins University. Before joining the staff at Penn State, she taught at the University of North Dakota, the University of New Orleans, and Morgan State College. In addition to her many honors and awards, she was listed in the 1979 edition of Who's Who in American Women. Some of Professor Toth's professional activities include membership in the Authors Guild and the Women's Caucus for the Modern Languages. She's formerly the editor of Regionalism and the Female Imaginations. She has edited and written several books, including A Kate Chopin Miscellany and the soon-to-be-published Female Wits, and a study of humor in American women's writing. Currently, she is working on a book about Grace Metalius, who is the author of Peyton Place. And now here's Emily Toth. Is this working right? Yes. A very pompous gentleman, a British gentleman, of course, once asked the British actress, Mrs. Patrick Campbell, why is it that women have no sense of humor? And she looked at him for a moment and then responded in her sweetest tones, why do women have no sense of humor? So we can love you men instead of laughing at you. Well, in real life, of course, women have done both. We both loved men and laughed at them, and often at the same time. But women's humor is not simply men's humor reversed. It has qualities of its own, and those are what I'd like to talk about in this talk. I first began studying women's humor in a context totally unrelated to menstruation. In 1976, Janice Delaney, Mary Jane Lufton, and I published our book called The Curse, A Cultural History of Menstruation. And we've been working on the book for several years before that, and had had considerable trouble finding a publisher. Editors couldn't decide whether such a book, called The Curse, was sexy or disgusting, and a question that's often raised about women's humor, too. Is it sexy or is it disgusting? Finally, Dutton did publish The Curse in hardback, and New American Library put it out in paperback. But editors at both houses had particular interest in one chapter in our book, the one called Red Humor, the Menstrual Joke. And the New American Library editor, a man, thought the chapter was hilarious. The Dutton editor, a woman, suspected it was not funny at all. And for the most part, I think she was right, and that she had a certain insight into what is and is not women's humor. We did consciously try to make The Curse a clever book and amusing. We have a chapter called The Menstrual Hall of Fame, which is about famous menstruators in history. We also have a chapter on the menstrual products industry, its history, called From Rags to Riches. But in spite of this, most of the jokes for our joke chapter are not really funny. I'll give you some examples, and feel free not to laugh. A young woman's boyfriend brags, I have a Honda. And she says, that's okay, I have my menstrual cycle. Or there's a story about the unusual vampires. They sat around chewing the rag. Or there's a riddle, why doesn't an elephant use a Tampax? If the average girl had to change them with her nose, she wouldn't use it. Now the last one, as I just noticed, is one that few, if any, women consider funny. Smells and stains are among a woman's greatest worries during that time, and they simply aren't really funny to women. Such jokes are pretty clearly made by men for men, and they do what Freud said non-innocent jokes do. That is, they're hostile and obscene, they're deliberately denuding and embarrassing another person, usually a woman. Generally, most of the well-known jokes concerning women, whether they involve menstruation or not, are hostile. They're hostile to women's appearance, especially age or fatness, or women's capabilities, especially in driving, or women's role in life, such as mother-in-law jokes. The rumor that women have no sense of humor probably comes about because being the butt of a joke usually isn't very funny. The idea that women have no sense of humor may also come about as a kind of fear. Because what if women are secretly doing exactly what Mrs. Patrick Campbell mentioned? What if they are laughing at men? Freud said that women do not tell jokes, but I can tell you he's wrong. Still, women's humor has a different quality from standard men's humor, and that's what I'd like to talk about for the rest of my time here. Women's humor follows a different set of rules, and one of the rules is what my students and I have come to call the humane humor rule, which I will now explain. Basically, the humane humor rule, which we write as HHR, goes like this. Thou shalt not make fun of things people cannot change, such as physical appearance, race, or handicaps. Things that people cannot change, including the sex they are not suitable targets for humor because the individuals haven't chosen to be handicapped, non-white, male, fat, skinny, or whatever. The suitable targets for humor are the choices that people do make. Their clothing, their behavior, their pomposities, their hypocrisies. And that's the humane humor rule. Now, some examples. The stand-up comic Elaine Boosler uses herself as a target for some of her humor, but in a humane way, unlike Phyllis Diller. Phyllis Diller does not follow the humane humor rule because self-hatred is part of her act. And a lot of the hatred has to do with appearance. But Elaine Boosler laughs at choices, including a very human need to impress other people. When she first started out as a comic, Elaine Boosler says she was thoroughly broke. She used to sleep on the floor, she had no furniture, her apartment was totally empty. And then she was hit with a crisis. She had a date of some sort, and she says, I brought somebody home one night. I was so embarrassed. I just opened the door and said, oh, I've been robbed. Now, Boosler is the victim in that story, but she's the victim of poverty, not of being a woman. And that's a big distinction between the old comedy, Phyllis Diller's sort, without a feminist understanding, and new women's comedy, which follows the humane humor rule and takes in women's perspective on events. Elaine Boosler shows herself as a victim, but she rises above her victimization by being tough and cool, even when she can't quite handle a situation. Another example she gives, quote, I never knew how to break up with people. One time I broke up with someone at a Halloween party. He was dressed as a turtle. I didn't know how to break it to him, so I just turned him on his back and left. Now, a lot of women's humor depends on turning cultural beliefs on their backs. Gail Parent, for instance, is best known as the creator of Mary Hartman, which is mentioned in the talk last night, but she's also written 2 novels whose humor depends on understanding the traditional social roles of women and men and choosing to overthrow them. In her first novel, which is called Sheila Levine is Dead and Living in New York, which Parent published in 1972, Sheila Levine represents every fat young woman who wants to get married because that's what everyone tells her she'd better do. Further, she's told, she should go into teaching, so she'll always have something to fall back on. I remember being told that. She should go to Europe to meet men. She should take a summer cottage, etc., etc. All the cliches of female conditioning are there, but they're so exaggerated that they become funny instead of deadly. Sheila herself is a cynic. When a movie is made of her life, she's convinced that if such a movie is ever made, the role of Sheila Levine will be played by Ernest Borgnine. She's excruciatingly honest about family life. At one point she confides to the reader, quote, I love my shitty sister. And she's very honest to herself about what's worth respecting. She says, I listened to anyone who was thin. Finally, at age 30, Sheila decides she's had it. She's still single, and she decides to finish off her life. This is the last act. It's the first original decision she's ever made, the decision to commit suicide, and she's ecstatic. She arranges for her gravestone, for her eulogy, her casket, and her burial plot, And there she has trouble, because like everything else, burial plots are made for couples. But she buys an expensive dress, really good underwear, a blonde wig to kill herself in. She decides she'll be really tacky and leave the price tags on. And when they find her body, she's really going to look good. Well, Sheila Levine is dead and living in New York, ends as one might expect for a comedy, but it's an excellent example of women's humor and the humane humor rule. When Sheila fails to capture a husband, she hates herself for not living up to society's norms. But once she chooses to find a way out, she appreciates herself much more and thinks that maybe it's the social rules that are a bit confused. Sheila Levine finds for herself a different norm. Rather than being married and expecting to live happily ever after, this new norm is independence. When Sheila stops listening to friends and family, she's a free woman. The trick is to die well, while always wearing clean underwear in case you get hit by a car. Now, another characteristic of female humor, then, is that it attacks social norms. Traditionally, satire attacks people who deviate from the norm. That is, people who refuse to fit into social roles, people who have bad breath, or look funny, or dress peculiarly. Sympathetic characters, traditionally, are characters like the heroes in Westerns, who fit in with the proper duties, follow the norms, do what's expected of them. But the norm for women, being passive, getting married, having kids, living happily ever after, isn't really much material for comedy. In fact, given the real-life divorce rate, it might seem closer to material for tragedy. So female humor generally, and especially recent female humorists, have done something new with humor. Instead of making fun of people who deviate from the norm, who refuse to follow a traditional path, they make fun of the norm itself. And I can illustrate the second quality of female humor, the attack on social norms, with another example from Gail Parent, from her second novel, 1976, called David Meyer is a Mother. And David Meyer is a Mother concerns a total reversal of social roles or of norms. David Meyer begins the book as a complete male chauvinist, whose life has been spent getting everything he can from women. Not only the usual backseat tussles in high school, but also other privileges of being male. He learns that because he's a boy, he doesn't have to pick up his underwear. He can steal little girls' lunches and they'll still invite him to boy-girl parties, and women will do anything if he tells them the right lies, until women's liberation, that is. And then he's found moaning, "The sexual revolution had begun, and I was fighting on the wrong side." The rules have changed. Women want equality and good sex, and David Meyer can't handle their demands. He's finally reduced to having a romance at a massage parlor, because they'll take his credit card there. He has to sleep with his boss, a woman, in order to keep his job. And he even develops cystitis and can't have sex because he's bleeding. So he imagines the headline in huge letters, "David Meyer menstruates." And filled with so many choices and no norms, he's in constant confusion. Should he use Secret or Right Guard? Should he smoke Virginia Slims or Marlboros? Should he identify with Adam or with Eve? When he eventually convinces his massage parlor friend, Linda, to live with him, he quits his job. He's going to become a full-time housewife, he decides. Then, to feel fulfilled, he has to have a baby. Of course, he has to talk Linda into that. But he even has labor pains when Linda does. And soon, up to his neck in baby food, he says, "I loved it. It was so much better than the world spitting up all over me." Well, the book, David Meyer is a Mother, has a certain bizarre logic. If women want men's rights, why not the opposite? If the home really is a haven in a heartless world, why not let either sex choose it? The book, in its own eccentric way, makes a case for the women's role, the housewife role, despised by so many other books, as fulfilling to some people. David Meyer as a Mother makes a good argument for equal rights because it's one of very few books in which people actually have them. David Meyer makes his own choices and his own norms. Besides generally following the humane humor rule and attacking traditional norms, Female humor has a third characteristic that should be fairly apparent, and that's its concentration on female subject matter. It's been argued, by the way, that women actually do more telling of Polish and other ethnic jokes than men do, and that telling such jokes is a covert attack on male power, since most of the butts or victims in Polish jokes are men. But I think a more inclusive view of female humor can be found if we look at what female humorists say about the female condition. And that takes us to Dorothy Parker, who in the 1920s and 1930s was the most famous and wittiest woman in New York, and maybe in the world. She was so famous and so noted for her barbs that people with her never went to the bathroom when she was around. They were afraid of what she'd say behind their backs. A lot of what she's famous for saying she never did say, and some of what she did say is cruel rather than humane, but she had a keen insight. Probably her best-known single piece of writing is the two-line snippet, "Men seldom make passes at girls who wear glasses," which was maybe been a statement of fact at the time she wrote it. But stating the fact made it seem ridiculous. So the poem was a kind of criticism of the norm. She also criticized romantic illusions, as in the poem "Unfortunate Coincidence." Quote, "By the time you swear you're his, shivering and sighing, and he vows his passion is infinite, undying, lady, make a note of this. One of you is lying." So she's not criticizing romance, but the delusions that people choose to have about romance. She also made fun of the poses people chose to adopt. About Dashiell Hammett, author of The Maltese Falcon, she said, "Dashiell Hammett is so hard-boiled you could roll him on the White House lawn." But her best work is in her short stories. Readers are apt to laugh first and then feel embarrassed for laughing at such a naked display of human frailty. For example, there's a very realistic beginning of a story called A Telephone Call, which is one of her best soliloquies or monologues. It goes like this: "Please, God, let him telephone me now. Dear God, let him call me now. I won't ask anything else of you. Truly, I won't. It isn't very much to ask. It would be so little to you, God, such a little thing. Only let him telephone now. Please, God. Please, please, please." Well, the cringing, the repetitions, the helplessness are familiar to anyone who's ever waited for a phone call. And so, too, are the games that Parker's heroine plays to get herself through the waiting. She tells herself if she doesn't think about it, maybe the phone will ring. Or maybe she should count to 500 by fives. And if it rings when she's at 300, she won't answer until she gets to 500. And then she tries to recall exactly what he said. Did he say he'd call at 5? And did he call her darling? Or should she call him? Should she call him? No, she tells herself. You shouldn't keep telephoning them, she says. I know they don't like that. When you do that, they know you were thinking about them and wanting them, and that makes them hate you. And the heroine always refers to men as them. They're the ones who make the rules. Then if he does call and say he can't see her, she thinks, well, she'll be sweet and say it's all right. She mustn't cry because they don't like it when you cry, and they also hate it when you say anything you really think. This is Parker. Well, a telephone call is sympathy and satire. It's half funny and half sad. Readers never agree, and it seems to depend on whether they've been waiting by the phone lately. I take polls of my students, by the way, when we read that, and it usually divides evenly. Half of them think it's funny and half think it's tragic, and then we find out it relates to their lives in some way. But nearly everyone recognizes the helplessness of the person who's waiting. Dorothy Parker also had a keen ear for what recent writers have called female language. That's the overuse of apologies, repetitions, and qualifiers to tone down what a woman's asking for, so she'll appear to be pleasing rather than demanding. It's the language of weakness. Yet men, too, identify with a telephone call, especially if they've ever counted to 500 by fives before lifting the phone to call. As long as social norms are the real target, everyone who can't choose to get away from them is a potential casualty. Dorothy Parker wrote about women, but as symbols of what might grandly be called the human condition. Irma Bombeck who's probably the best-known female humorist today, clearly writes about the female condition, or about female subject matter, particularly house and home. People who don't read Irma Bombeck, or who don't see her on television, have the idea that she glorifies pots and pans, talks about the sweet little things children say, and generally reconciles women to the problems of being a wife and mother in a complex society. She doesn't. Like other female humorists, Irma Bombeck is a social critic, and one who attacks the norm more and more in recent years. But to understand what she's doing, we have to look briefly at her predecessor, Peg Bracken, whose book, The I Hate to Cook book, was an enormous bestseller in 1960. The I Hate to Cook book and the books and articles Bracken published after it were not oriented toward making women better cooks. That would be following the norm. Rather, Peg Bracken had a very different purpose in mind: how to get by if you hate to cook. Peg Bracken conceived her idea in conversations with women friends as they compared miseries and shared recipes. Out of their recipes, she thought, why don't I put together a book on cooking for women who hate to cook? And so she began writing the I Hate to Cook book. Her husband, who's now an ex-husband, said the idea was a sure loser. Her agent thought it was impossible. Several editors, male editors, turned it down, saying, why, women think cooking is sacred. But a woman editor, Jeanette Hopkins, loved the idea, promoted the book, and it was an immediate hit. By 1960, women were beginning to talk about housework as a millstone rather than as a sacred calling. And the I Hate to Cook book sold over 2 million copies, went into 25 printings, was also published in England, the Netherlands, and Africa, as well as the United States. The recipes are simple and surprisingly good, but even better and more important are the discussions between the recipes. The discussions are of shortcuts, trickery, methods of disguising one's wretched cooking. Garnishes, for instance, hide the cook's shortcomings, which would show clearly if guests could see a plateful of nude food. The idea is to hide, to conceal, to bamboozle the eating audience. In other words, to subvert the norm. Equally useful are the specific strategies for domestic deception. Say, for instance, a cook is serving dinner rolls that she bought frozen and then reheated in the oven. But she wants her husband to think she made them herself, since homemade goodies are much more impressive. So at dinner, Peg Bracken says this is what she should do. You taste them critically, and then you say, darn it, I simply can't make decent rolls, and that's all there is to it. And a loyal husband will be comforting. These taste swell, he'll say. And then the wife says, in a finicky sort of female voice, well, they just don't seem quite right. And the man says, they're fine. And the more she says they're not right, and the more he says they're fine, well, admittedly, Bracken concedes this is underhanded. But then marriage is sometimes a rough game. And the point is not to be an ideal cook, nor a spotless housekeeper. That's an impossible ideal, a norm to live up to. Rather, Bracken criticizes the norm by showing how a woman can ignore much of it and fake the rest, thereby achieving the blissful state. She's no longer guilty about housework and has time and energy for other things, like writing books. In 1963, 3 years after the I Hate to Cook book, Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique, the book that destroyed the norm of the happy homemaker. The Feminine Mystique was wildly attacked when it appeared because it said what wasn't supposed to be said. It talked about the problem that has no name, the feminine mystique, which was the fact that not every woman felt her place should be in the home. Not every woman wanted to devote her life to being someone's wife and someone's mother. Most women wanted to be people first, with the choices men had, but in 1963, the choices were not there. Instead, in the home, women found themselves drowning in the kinds of trivial concerns that Gail Perrin showed in Mary Hartman, where waxy yellow buildup is Mary's neurosis. So The Feminine Mystique is an angry book, and it says openly, what Peg Bracken said humorously: woman's place is too small a world, especially when it's a world that the person has not chosen. The feminine mystique helped start the women's movement, which by 1968 was insisting on legal abortion, equal pay for equal work, and equal opportunity. The way was also opened for new forms of humor, with a wider vision of women's possibilities. Erica Jong and Lily Tomlin both expressed that spirit of 1968, the refusal to be defensive or to be housewifey heartwarming about being a woman. By the late 1960s, women writers and comedians could begin producing one-liners that killed. And that brings us back to Erma Bombeck. Erma Bombeck has always talked about herself as the victim of a conspiracy, what I would call social norms. As she says in her book, At Wit's End, surveying the chaotic state of the house on Monday morning, what's a nice girl like me doing in a place like this? Now, the question's not a new one, of course, but what's new is that the woman is asking the question herself. It's not the old movie Come On, in which the tough guy hero asks the vulnerable heroine, what's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this? Rather, Bombeck chooses to ask the question herself and to look for the villains. Who are they? Among others, she says, it's those rotten kids. Instead of letting her wake up at her own speed, they lurk by her bedside, and she hears them conspiring. I think she hears us. Her eyelids fluttered. Wait until she turns over, then everybody cough. Why don't we just punch her and ask her what we want to know? Meanwhile, her husband won't get up in the morning. He keeps resetting his alarm clock every 15 minutes or so. Each time it goes off, he whacks it into submission, yelling, no one tells me what to do, buddy. Well, neither Irma's children nor her husband, who resembles John Wayne physically, nor Irma herself is a blind follower of social norms. Even her first household hints column, which she wrote in the 1940s, called Operation Dust Rag, was too irreverent for her time. It didn't last long. Instead of removing chocolate stains from overstuffed furniture, for instance, she advised beating the stuffings out of the little boy who'd eaten the chocolate on the furniture. She was fired. In the 1940s, she says now, you didn't make fun of domestic chores. Housework was a religious experience. Erma Bombeck's humor has never been sweetness and light. She's not above revenge. In one of her books, she threatens a department store clerk that if Irma is not treated right, Irma will release a pregnant moth in the fur vault of the store. But Bombeck's humor has changed in recent years. Since her children have grown up, and they're now in their 20s, Bombeck has developed an edge to her column that wasn't there before. The edge comes out in stronger support for the women's movement, along with an insistence that housewives deserve respect and understanding. As early as 1967, Erma Bombeck was taking swipes at the housewife mother's trap. If she complains, she's neurotic. If she doesn't, she's stupid. If she stays home with the children, she's an overprotective, boring clod. If she leaves home to work, she's obviously selfish. And Bombeck predicts direly, her children will write dirty words in nice places. Well, that was in 1967. By 1976, Erma Bombeck had developed her edge and was willing to attack the housewife ideal, the social norm, head on. Supermom is a character in The Grass is Always Greener Over the Septic Tank. Supermom is the incarnation of the housewife mother ideal. She does everything right, including waxing her garden hose, and other things too. She puts all the neighbors, who call themselves the interim mothers, to shame. Supermom cuts her own grass, bakes her own bread, sews all her children's clothes, irons, cooks, votes, goes to the dentist, helps her dog deliver puppies, and even keeps a pencil by the telephone. Supermom, also known as Estelle, is so perfect that the neighbors can't stand her. Someone who fits the norm so thoroughly, they suspect, ought to have her life examined. But gradually, After getting both open and insidious comments from neighbors, Estelle begins to change. First, she does little things, like buying a deodorant that's not on sale. A little later, she runs out of gas. And then she forgets to tie her garbage bags together. So everyone on the street discovers she's been secretly cooking TV dinners. And finally, she makes the ultimate break. "Mommy, Mommy," one of her children screams wildly, "I was on the side using a toothpaste with fluoride and I only have one cavity." Estelle looks at her silently for a full minute and then says, "Who cares?" Bombeck concludes triumphantly, "She was one of us." To be one of us, in Erma Bombeck's world, means not accepting the mold society would put a woman into. It means saying the unmentionable, recognizing, as Bombeck says, that supermom can be a super sucker, no more appreciated than women whose children send Mother's Day cards to Colonel Sanders. Erma Bombeck does get hate mail. Sometimes she even gets censored. When she used the word bathroom, for instance, the editor of a little newspaper in Pennsylvania threatened to drop her column. When she wrote about a name tag on her bosom, some papers changed the word bosom to shoulder. She gets away with attacking the housewife mother ideal, it seems, but anything that hints at sex, which is the bathroom or the bosom, is still taboo. And it's around taboo subjects, of course, that humor has always flourished. Recent female humorists have frequently used taboo subjects, such as menstruation. They've also written about a young woman's first sexual experience in realistic detail, instead of the earth-moving, bells-ringing, thunderous passions, bodies soaring to the stars. For instance, in Kinflix, the 1976 novel by Lisa Althor, Ginny, the heroine, has a very different initiation into sex. When Erica Jong wrote in Fear of Flying about her heroine's desire for, quote, the zipless fuck, the impulsive but fantastic sexual experience uncomplicated by guilt, other people, or stuck zippers, Jong's critics acted as if she'd committed an act of pornography by using the word. Fear of Flying was called whiny, self-indulgent, and even smutty, and one typesetter refused to set the more colorful words. In fact, when I mentioned the zipless fuck in a review for the Baltimore Sun, I saw it in print as the zipless copulation. Well, notwithstanding critics, typesetters, etc., Fear of Flying remains a very funny book 7 years after publication, though what was then shocking is no longer so. The comparisons between food and sex, good sex is like ripe goat cheese, are still witty. The book has exuberance, energy, earthiness, and actually very little sex. The sex object the heroine pursues, a British analyst named Adrian Goodlove, is impotent most of the time. But Isadora, the heroine, follows the humane humor rule. She does not make fun of him for that, for what he cannot help. Rather, she's more likely to blame herself. Like so many women, like women who believe in the super mom norm, she falls very easily into guilt. In fact, Isadora says, "Show me a woman who doesn't feel guilty, and I'll show you a man." In the sequel to Fear of Flying, the book called How to Save Your Own Life, Isadora finds love with a new man, and also learns to stop blaming herself. For women's humor is not only humane, as we've seen, but also an attempt to overcome female conditioning, to overcome the norm. The norm is the idea that women must be pleasing to others and must feel guilty if they are not pleasing. And it may be that an orientation toward pleasing leads women's humor to be humane rather than cruel. even when the targets are so tempting. Much of the criticism of Fear of Flying was really criticism directed against a woman's being aggressive, especially sexually aggressive. But writing itself has always been regarded as an acceptable feminine act, since it takes place in the privacy of one's own home. Even more aggressive is performing in public, like this. Most aggressive of all is being a stand-up comic. A stand-up comic has to be active and reach out, unlike the proper lady who simply responds to other people. A stand-up comic works alone, without the props other people provide. Often she dresses in a neuter rather than a feminine way, and she has to be able to assert herself over an audience. Only 12% of full-time stand-up comics are women. The best of them, I think, is Lily Tomlin, who criticizes social norms in a humane manner. She plays people who ought to be victims in a typical view of the world: a paraplegic, a whiny-voiced telephone operator, a 77-year-old swinging evangelist named Sister Boogie Woman. But as played by Lily Tomlin, none of these people are victims. They're all feisty, funny fighters against anybody who dare try to make them victims. It's so easy in comedy, Lily Tomlin says, to ridicule the characters that you do. It's too easy and low. And asked what her characters have in common, she says, they have humanity, a human vulnerability, a dignity, even when they're in ridiculous situations. The most unusual of Lily Tomlin's characters is a recent creation, Crystal, the terrible tumbleweed. Crystal is a quadriplegic who's played just like this, without moving. She's working her way cross-country in a CB-equipped wheelchair in order to go hang gliding off Big Sur in California. At a carnival in Illinois, a kid climbs into her lap and says, "Are you a ride?" And Crystal says proudly, "I'm probably the best ride here." Crystal is handicapped physically, but not at all otherwise. In fact, she says, the rest of us have our limitations. Most people are only walkies. And Crystal is better equipped for hang gliding, she says. Walkies got to worry about crashing and hurting themselves. I'm just out for a good time. Crystal always got the most applause when Lily Tomlin did her one-woman stage show called Appearing Nightly in 1977. Audiences never knew quite whether to laugh or cry, but they knew they were moved in a way that goes beyond traditional satire. For Lily Tomlin is interested not so much in human targets, but in people's sensitive areas. Not to laugh at them, so much as to understand and sympathize. And that's why she developed her first male character, Rick, the bar stud. He works nights at his buddy's gas station, but his real job is delivering Sparkletts bottled water during the day. He says, "I like driving for Sparkletts because it gets me outdoors and into a lot of ladies' houses." He's a typical would-be macho man who hangs out at discos and describes what he likes in women, including, quote, "a good caboose, firm but pliant." He wants to be the boss, he says. And this is a quote again. "If the Lord intended for women to be on top, he would have put them there, if you get my meaning." Well, unquote. Despite his super stud lines, Rick is really a failure. He's separated from his wife. He never manages to pick up anyone in bars. When audiences laugh at Rick, though, they're laughing at and pitying the norms that make men feel they must behave that way. Rick is less a silly male than a vulnerable human being. Lily Tomlin's comedy also suggests directions in which women's humor might eventually go. Many people, including the science fiction writer Joanna Russ, have written about the absurdities of female-male distinctions. In an essay entitled, "What Can a Heroine Do?" or "Why Women Can't Write?" Joanna Russ suggests some good plots for stories. I'll read you some of them. Two strong women battle for supremacy in the early West. Or, a young girl in Minnesota finds her womanhood by killing a bear. Or, a young man who unwisely puts success in business before his personal fulfillment loses his masculinity and ends up as a neurotic, lonely eunuch. Well, naturally, the plots are ridiculous, as role reversals usually are, although the young man who winds up as a neurotic, lonely eunuch isn't entirely removed from Lily Tomlin's Rick, the bar stud. What both Joanna Russ and Lily Tomlin want, though, is not only role reversal, but role opening. Russ writes about the need for new myths and traditions instead of redefining the old ones. Tomlin is making a new tradition in the mixture of laughter and tears that shows us all our strengths and our weaknesses. Women have never been known for unrestrained laughing. Men guffaw and chuckle and bellow and hoot with laughter. Women are more apt to titter, snicker, smile, or giggle softly. We're taught, of course, to be more restrained in our behavior, but it could be that until recently we've also had less to laugh at. We might ultimately ask ourselves one of the big, mostly unanswerable questions. What is the future for women's humor? Will satire be possible if society's norms don't oppress people? Or does women's humor need a mingling of satisfaction and resentment? In the ideal society, would we cease being limited to our respective bellows and giggles and all be able to chortle together, regardless of sex? Would we all be humane in our humor? We do know that we need laughter. Modern science has even shown us that those who laugh more live longer. And laughter is a cure for the pains of living, especially when the laughter is unrestrained, limited only by the one who laughs. Crystal, Lily Tomlin's paraplegic character, says, "I can take being confined to a wheelchair. It's being confined to the rules that gives me rigor mortis." Thank you. I guess I'd take questions if there are any comments.